Martha is Dead is a fictional horror game containing disturbing imagery that may be distressing to some viewers. Viewer discretion is highly advised. Most of you watching this video right now might know of Martha is Dead solely based upon that grotesque and visceral scene I just showed you. For context, on February 11th, 2022, 2 weeks before the launch of Martha is Dead, the team behind the game revealed that the physical retail release of Martha is Dead on the PS5 was delayed due to Sony's abrupt decision to censor this highly violent scene. Sony's decision to do this, of course, was massively controversial, and the social media buzz surrounding this controversy is what clued me and many others into this game. The most shocking thing about this hyper-brutal scene, however, is that despite the mass media scrutiny on this one particular display of violence, this scene is not actually representative of the true horrors that Martha is Dead has to offer. While it's true that Martha is Dead has an assortment of similarly intense and gory scenes meant to disturb you, these scenes are not the primary reason for why this game is so horrifying. And that's why I'm making this video essay, to offer an alternative discourse to this game and showcase its brilliance in not just its most macabre moments, but also in its terrifying subtlety as well. Despite what Martha is Dead looks like on the surface, it isn't a game about jump scares, nor is it about a constant bombardment of shock imagery. Martha is Dead is a more subtle horror experience akin to a slow burn psychological horror film. And it is in this game's tiny details where you'll find absolute, pure, unadulterated fear. So let's take a closer look at those details and find out just why I think that Martha is Dead is an excellent subtle horror experience worth your time. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the premise of Martha is Dead, the game is set in Tuscany during World War II, and it follows a young woman named Julia, who finds her identical twin sister Martha dead in the lake near their home. Julia is discovered by her parents sitting beside her dead sister's body at the edge of the lake, but her mother immediately mistakes her for Martha and wrongfully assumes that it is Julia instead who is dead. Julia does not correct her mother, however, as this is the first time her mother has ever shown her any legitimate affection in her entire life. Unlike Martha, Julia is unloved and abused constantly by her mother, who has always preferred Martha. The game picks up on the very next day, where Julia has now fully taken over her dead sister's identity, down to mimicking every single one of her mannerisms and peculiarities, ranging from reading the newspaper, to wearing her outfits, to sleeping in her bed, and she even manages to act like she's deaf, just like Martha was. There's obviously a lot more to the story, such as investigating the cause of Martha's death and determining whether or not the urban legend of the vengeful ghost in the lake is real. But I'll examine the narrative in greater depth in the next section. For now, I want to redirect our focus back to the subtle yet horrifying details that make Martha is Dead as unsettling as it is. Firstly, the very premise of the game is fantastic, as it instantly puts you into an uneasy mindset right from the get-go. One thing I'll always emphasize on this YouTube channel is the importance of examining how a piece of art can make you feel, because those feelings are what shape your experience with that particular piece of art and whether or not you connect with its artist's intentions. And in the case of Martha is Dead, the game's slow buildup of small, unsettling moments are what drive you into a constant state of paranoia. A feeling that creative director Luca Dalco most definitely wants you to experience. When Dalco was a child, he would visit Tuscany every summer where the ominously quiet Tuscan landscape always filled him with a sense of dread. And Martha is Dead captures that feeling of dread perfectly. Not only is it set during a violent period in history where dread was an inevitable consequence of war, but it is exactly that silent landscape that Dalco talks about that makes this game so frightening. Again, it wasn't the disturbing imagery that truly scared me in this game. It was the unspoken, beneath-the-surface horrors that terrified me. The very moment you start this game, everything already feels off because you're not quite yourself. You're masquerading as a dead person, and the game doesn't need to say anything to make you feel unnerved about it. All you need to do is read a newspaper or put on some clothes, and it just makes you feel wrong. Inside of Julia and Martha's room is a painting of a scene from Little Red Riding Hood. It depicts the grandma character in the moments just before she's eaten by the wolf who steals her identity. This small detail contributes to the uneasiness associated with Julia's decision to assume her sister's identity. Julia, when compared to the wolf in the story of Little Red Riding Hood, is also taking over the identity of a murdered individual. And even though it isn't necessarily nefarious on Julia's part, the comparison is enough to make you feel like something deeply sinister is happening beneath the surface. And the identity theft isn't the only thing that makes you feel tense and rattled and paranoid. It's everything that surrounds you. Every little detail. When you walk through the woods, it always feels as if something is watching you. The trees are oppressive and suffocating, and it feels like something can be hiding behind each and every one of them. The game knows you fear this, too, because a ghost even appears behind one of the trees at some point during the story. And when you stumble upon the locked gate in the woods, it unsurprisingly feels like something sinister hides behind it. And until you figure out its mystery, you'll feel paranoid about its existence and what might lurk inside. There are more subtle details in these woods that can fill you with dread, too. As you wander around, you can hear the faint sound of flies buzzing in a certain area. And even though you can't find anything, it implies that something dead might be near. Just take a listen to see what I'm talking about. It's eerie. I also need to emphasize that this game makes use of an extensive picture-taking mechanic where you must use a film camera to take photos of things and develop them. It's hyper-realistic to the point of seeming tedious, but this camera generates more horror in the game than anything else. There's this constant fear of discovering something creepy in your photos when you go to develop them. You don't know if there will be a ghost, a monster, a crime, or whatever else you might find disturbing. And sometimes, things really do appear in them. And these payoffs are what make taking photos such an ominous experience. Taking photos and developing them in this game is a slow and serene experience. But beneath that peace and serenity is a subtle, underlying fear of the unknown. And this probably describes the game as a whole. Almost everything about it is so quiet and slow, and yet, despite this, you just can't shake that feeling of dread no matter what you do. For example, there's a point in the game where you have to painstakingly send a series of secret telegrams to an unknown individual in order to stop a tank from terrorizing the Tuscan rebels. It's a slow and deliberate and quiet process, yet at the same time, there's this feeling of dread that comes with it. What if someone catches you? Did you send the message correctly? Is it the right choice to be communicating with this individual? Who even is it on the other side? And why did your dead friend Lapo entrust this task to you, knowing the danger it poses to you and your family? Danger is an important word, and it's what drives much of the dread in this game. You never feel safe or comfortable no matter what you do. There's a small detail in one of the later issues of the newspaper that mentions how the Germans will shoot anyone on a bike and to avoid riding one at all costs. And yet, the game gives you access to riding a bike, and Julia has no problem hopping on it if you prompt her to. This detail is so important in describing the way that I think this game is filled with subtle little details meant to scare you. It's such an understated moment in the game, so much so to the point that you can easily miss it. But if you don't miss it, that's just one more extra thing to be afraid about. And again, I'll emphasize this once more. There's no shortage of small details like that. If you listen to the radio, there are mentions of rape and violence and bombings and death because of the war. And it makes wandering around just feel so unsafe, even if you're in the beautiful countryside. There are planes that fly overhead. There are soldiers that appear in the woods. And your father is a general in the army with clearly many enemies. And this is just talking about the physical danger that Julia faces. I'm not even mentioning the threat of the vengeful ghost that seems to haunt this place.
Julia.
Before I talk about one last final detail whose implications are far more horrifying than anything else in this game, I want to briefly commend Martha is Dead for having such an incredible soundtrack. The soundtrack is what ties everything together. The soundtrack is what makes the horror experience complete. The soundtrack itself is a detail. It's muted, controlled, deliberate, and quiet when it builds tension, and it's wild, discordant, unhinged, and jarring when it detonates that tension. It really makes its most disturbing moments feel earned. Just take a look at the difference between these two scenes. The soundtrack dichotomizes the subtle ominousness of its quiet scenes and the overt terror of its more intense scenes. And because of this, the more understated horror elements of the game are allowed to breathe and slowly build that omnipresent nervous tension I was talking about. In other words, the game's horror doesn't hinge upon its shock factor. Instead, it's equally unsettling when it's loud and when it's quiet. But for all of the game's terrifying moments, nothing beats the horror of one small, seemingly insignificant detail you might miss if you don't pay close enough attention. And that is the mention of the drug Pervitin. Throughout the game, Julia often mentions her mother abusing a medication called Pervitin, and these pill bottles are littered all over the house. You can even find some on Julia's father's desk and in Martha's trinket box. When Julia calls the family doctor to ask about them, however, he knows that they're illegal, and her mother gets it through the German army. Now, if you're fairly well versed in World War II history, or if you have some highly specific pharmaceutical knowledge, you might realize why this Pervitin thing is such a huge problem. In 1937, a German chemist named Friedrich Hauschild managed to synthesize methamphetamine for a Berlin-based pharmaceutical company. And he sold it under the brand name, you guessed it, Pervitin. The drug became an instant hit and was famously used by Hitler to fuel an army of chemically enhanced soldiers. Soldiers who could fight harder and longer than their enemy. Of course, despite the German army's massive initial success with the drug, keeping your entire army on fucking meth obviously isn't sustainable. So the military eventually cut back on the drug due to their addictive nature. We all know that meth is bad. Well, at least I hope you know that. But in the context of Martha is dead, this detail means everything. Meth is known to potentially cause irritability, aggression, and violent behaviors. And many of those who abuse it can suffer from a form of psychosis known as stimulant psychosis. Those experiencing psychosis are susceptible to a wide variety of symptoms, most notably paranoia, hallucinations, and delirium. And this explains everything that happens in the game. Everyone in the house is clearly taking Pervitin for some reason or another. And because of this, they all suffer from an assortment of issues that cause each and every one of the horrors in this game. Pervitin partly explains why Julia's mother is so abusive towards her. I say partly because I'm pretty sure she was abusive towards her before the meth, but it most definitely plays a part in amping up her aggression. Pervitin explains why Julia often forgets things that happened, like what happened on the morning of Martha's death. Pervitin explains why Julia lashes out violently at her mother after accusing her of killing Martha. Pervitin explains why Julia kills and dismembers her mother and doesn't remember doing it. Pervitin explains Julia's vivid hallucinations of violent, ghostly figures. Pervitin explains all the fear, anger, and paranoia in the family. Pervitin, and that tiny little pill, seems to be responsible for much of the terror plaguing this suffering family. And it's the perfect symbol of horror in this game. Pervitin is not only a horror in Julia's domestic life, but it's also a horror in the world beyond Julia's estate. It is a horror indicative of war, a terrifying and brutal monster that kills more than any ghost Julia can encounter. And that's why the subtle horrors of Martha is Dead are so brilliant. Their ability to disturb you and make you feel just as paranoid and afraid as Julia is a powerful feeling. But as much as I love the subtle horrors this game has to offer, there's more to the terror of this game than just its microscopic details. We have to zoom out a bit and look at it as a whole. And to do that, we must look at its narrative. I have to preface this section by clarifying that I will not be summarizing the game as a whole, but rather pointing out one key aspect about it that I think is worth noting, because otherwise, this video will go on for far too long. The narrative of Martha is Dead is open to multiple lines of interpretation. If you haven't played the game, then I must emphasize that Martha is Dead concludes with a highly ambiguous ending with many disturbing implications. Julia, after supposedly murdering her mother on the assumption that she killed Martha, and after witnessing the death of her father who was mistaken as a rebel, ends up in a mental asylum after seeking the help of the town priest. So her recounting of the game's events cannot necessarily be trusted. I choose to believe that everything in the game happened, but with the caveat that Julia's hallucinations and cloudy memory led her to remember the cause of events differently, not the results. So even though we're unsure of whether or not it was Julia, or her mother, or the ghost, or a soldier, or even the groundskeeper who killed Martha, we can be sure that Martha, indeed, is dead. Photo evidence seems to suggest that it was Julia who killed Martha, though we cannot be sure as to why she would do that. It could have been the meth, or Julia mistaking Martha for the ghost in the lake, but it could have been other things too. Maybe she killed Martha because she discovered her having sex with Lapo, who was her boyfriend. Maybe she killed Martha to hide the truth of their pregnancies. Maybe she killed Martha because she was jealous of how their mother treated her. Or maybe it really was their mother who killed Martha. Martha, after all, apparently lied this whole time about being deaf, and she tricked their mother into thinking she was Julia so she would get the chance to argue back against their mother in Julia's place, since Julia was always afraid to talk back to her. Their mother, in her anger, killed Martha thinking that she was Julia. Or maybe Martha just never existed at all. We cannot know the truth, and it's this constant ambiguity throughout the game that can make it a rocky experience for players. While I don't think that the ambiguity necessarily damages the story, I do think that it makes its messaging a bit harder to decipher. But part of the game's experience requires you to be a bit confused. We, like Julia, are supposed to be lost and hallucinating and distressed and angry the whole way through. We, as the player, are experiencing what Julia is feeling. And those feelings are where I want to focus my thoughts on next. At the end of the game, Julia looks at a reflection of herself to determine which of the events in the game were true. And there are no right answers. Because that's the point. Julia has completely lost herself and her thoughts after tragedy. And no matter what the explanation is, it's all equally horrifying. Whatever it is that happened, Julia has been through a lot. And for those suffering from mental trauma, sometimes it isn't about any of the details. It's about those terrible and unsettling feelings stemming from the tragedy they faced. So whatever it is you think that happened, just remember how the game made you feel. Just remember the paranoia, the fear, the anger, and the sadness. Those feelings are more important than the story. Those feelings are the real, immutable truth. Just like for Julia, the details may be muddled, but your terror was not. Martha is Dead is not a perfect game. I want to make that clear. It's littered with stuttering and other technical issues. Its gameplay can be described as slow and tedious, and its approach to mental health can be more confusing than illuminating. And yet, despite all of this, I have to emphasize that this game is nevertheless brilliant enough to be worth playing. Technical issues aside, Martha is Dead is a daring artistic approach to a horror game, and I think its efforts should be recognized. Like the photos that Julia captures and examines, the game wants you to consume its artistic horrors slowly and with precision. It wants you to admire its every detail, even if those details can sometimes be blemishes. You don't have to enjoy the tedious gameplay mechanics, I'll give you that. But for me personally, video games are experiences I evaluate by the way they make me feel or think, just like other art. And Martha is Dead made me feel uncomfortable and paranoid and terrified in all the right ways. Not everyone will necessarily feel that way, but I bought into its slower nature, and I still think about how unsettling many of its moments were. If you haven't played the game yourself, check it out and see if you have a similar experience as I do. I would love to hear what other people have to say about the game, so leave a comment down below and let me know what you thought. Martha is Dead, no matter what you think of it, paid close attention to crafting fine details worth taking a look at. and I hope that, like me, you can see just how magnificent many of those subtle details are. If you enjoyed this video essay, don't forget to like and subscribe if you'd like to see more content similar to this. I make videos about all things writing related. I'd also like to thank my patron Edith Lopez Torres for helping make this video happen. If you'd like to support me further, please check out my Patreon. I'll leave a link down in the description below. And if you've got some time, check out some of my other videos too. I really appreciate you watching this one. And to everyone who made it to the end here, thank you all for watching, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.